the case that I chose to do, my declaration of topic, because I know it's one of the things, is the National Football League players' concussion injury litigation. They couldn't come up with a shorter name, apparently. I chose to do this case because, like, as a former athlete, I've suffered multiple concussions, and my dad was also, he played in college, so, like, I kind of always watch him, make sure he's not going to go off the deep end at any point. The legal things we're going to be discussing is the use of Section 301 laws and collective bargaining agreements to preempt lawsuits. And then, of course, we'll just go over how this lawsuit ends. Okay, so how CTE and concussion in sports became, a big thing in the news. Suicides of players like Junior Seau, Dave Durson, and Ray Easterling. There's others that have died more recently that you heard of. Some murder-suicides where the rage just becomes too much for them to handle. It's also found in boxers, hockey players, rugby players, not just football players, but because football is considered America's sport now, you'll hear more about these guys. Concussions and CTE. CTE is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It is a degenerate brain disease that can cause rage, confusion, dementia, depression. If you've seen the movie Concussion, you kind of have an idea of what this is about. It can't be diagnosed. It can't be officially diagnosed while you're alive. You have to be dead because they have to look at your brain. But they've been able to find proteins in living players that they've also found within the former players' brains that they can kind of have an idea that you do have it, and it will only get worse. The Boston University Center for Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy, they took 35 brains of former players, and out of the 35, 34 showed signs of CTE in them. The NFL, this started to become a big deal around 2011 is when things started to come out. So they made new rules, and if you watch football, you know about them. A lot of them claim it's making it more powder puff because the hits have to be a little less aimed at the head, but they have seen less concussions in players. Now they don't know if it's because players aren't reporting them or if it's because there's an actual decrease. Dave Durson and Ray Easterling, who you've heard about, sued in 2011 and in 2012, and that caused a whole lot of other players to come in. Because there were so many lawsuits, they petitioned the court to be able to just put them all in one massive case, which was granted January 31st, 2012. And then officially, June 7, 2012, the lawsuits of 2,200 former players were condensed into one suit, which is known as the National Football League Players' Concussion Injury Litigation. The lawsuit alleged intentional tortious misconduct, fraud, intentional misrepresentation, and negligence by the NFL. So basically, the NFL knew the link between concussions and long-term brain injury, but failed to warn its players or put rules in place to protect them. They formed the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, and they formed it to study concussions in football, and then they hid the results from the players and didn't tell them what they actually found. This is where it gets really boring, and I'm sorry. Okay, so Section 301, federal law preempts state claims related to rights under a collective bargaining agreement, and state claims substantially dependent upon the interpretation of collective bargaining agreement. Okay, so that's all just like a big bunch of hodgepodge that means nothing to any of you. So basically, they're all part of a collective bargaining agreement, and in the collective bargaining agreement, they have detailed rights that each party has signed to agree to. That when they have problems, they have to go through arbitration procedures that they agree to as one of their collective bargaining agreements. So basically, CBAs address the elements of the player's claims, such as duty, or the court is required to analyze various provisions to determine of those duties. So basically, if they have to go back and look at the provisions, the courts can't touch it. Because they signed the collective bargaining agreements, they've agreed to all the terms. So these are the numerous provisions. Just player care is put on the club physician, athletic trainers. Rules and player safeties were agreed upon by the NFL Players Association, and the NFL grievance procedures have to go through arbitration. They cannot be brought up in lawsuits. Player benefits, workers' comp, and then retirees are responsible for their own medical care after they retire. The NFL only has to pay costs for certain eligible former players. They're not responsible for all of them. So when they took this litigation suit, it is a labor dispute. That's how they're fighting it. And because they used Section 301 to preempt, which means just like throw them out, just throw out the case. Like they're very successful. They've had tons of cases, And while the courts do have to consider every case by case, they have to do it individually, most of them just get knocked out because of the provisions and how the courts will just stay out of it. Okay, so this is a case of how they use Section 301 laws. Stringer versus the National Football League. Corey Stringer, a lineman for the Minnesota Vikings, next morning after a practice, he suffered heat stroke and died from the complications. His wife filed a suit, said that the NFL breached their duty of care to the players, and they failed to provide current information to staff in order to prevent the heat stroke. This is how the 301 comes into play. In order to preempt, 301 has to do one of two things. The claim either has to come from the collective bargaining agreement, which means they can't cover it, or the court's official recommendation of the claim is substantially dependent on the interpretation. So basically they have to go, if you sue, and they have to look at part of the CBA to figure out what's happening, they can't touch it because it is inextricably intertwined. So it's not its own thing, it's already covered. Okay, so in this case, the NFL failed to satisfy the first prong. The collective bargaining agreement did not contain any provision that bestowed upon the NFL the duty, so they didn't have a duty of care to protect them from heat stroke. But the NFL on its own initiative released the hot weather guidelines for members of the teams to kind of precautions they could take on their own to prevent heat stroke. So even though this case did not arise from the collective bargaining agreement, it was thrown out because it was inextricably intertwined and substantially dependent on the interpretation of specific provisions of the CBA. So you're going to see that most of the little example cases that are in here, that's basically all of them get preempted because they're inextricably intertwined and substantially dependent upon interpreting those provisions. So basically they just get thrown out right away. So degree of care is not considered in a vacuum. But however, the NFL did settle with Stringer's widow in 2009. The NFL implemented changes that brought awareness and dangers of heat-related illness. Players can no longer use ephedrine, which can be extremely dangerous if they use it in the heat. And they also donated money to Corey Stringer Institute. Okay, the duty of care. The trainer's certification requirement process and the duties of the team doctors are the two provisions that kind of show the NFL's duty of care to its players. Okay, so here are the two other cases that I was talking about. Durson's case and then another player, Maxwell, both sued the Football League, but they all came down to that to figure out if the NFL's duty of care was breached, they had to interpret the provisions in the thing, and they can't because they're inexplicably intertwined. So, if you want to read that, I can go back, but it's just
8 minutes.
Okay. So the case between Stringer and this litigation case are very similar. They both dealt with health and safety issues in the NFL's voluntary release. Like the former player's complaint now has the NFL's voluntary undertaking. So their CTE case, basically, when they decide to study it on their own, they voluntarily took a duty of care. So each case, is considered, individually, but like I said, most cases with the NFL get preempted. Negligence or fraud, none of them ever go through because, like I said, and it's the big thing, it will cause preemption because the court would have to look at and interpret collective bargaining agreement provisions to determine the duty of the NFL to its former players. So negligence or fraud, which are two of the points they're suing them for, get preempted right away because they have to look at the provisions. Oh, I might have skipped a page. That's fine. We'll rough and roll around it. Okay. So these are basically who's responsible for player safety and health provisions. Team doctors, medical and hospital staff, board certified orthopedic surgeons, trainers, and doctors on the ambulance site. So the NFL's duty of care to its players can only be determined by looking at the provisions, which, like the whole thing says, they can't do. So the court would have to, so they can't determine whose duty is cared. This is basically just kind of summing it up a little easier. The court cannot make a decision on negligence or fraud claims without interpreting particular provisions. Each claim is inextricably intertwined with each provisions of the collective bargaining agreement and is preempted. They do have an arbitration provision, which means they have to go through the agreed upon legal process. They can't just bring up lawsuits. These are other provisions that kind of player injury, player negligence, kind of how they'll deal with things. The players claim that they sustained concussions throughout their playing careers and played through the concussions because they did not understand the consequences. So the main argument, so negligence and fraud have been thrown out, but the NFL embarked upon a misinformation campaign about serious long-term damage from concussions and hid it from their players. So basically, the research team that was set just totally lied. There is some controversy about this study because they say they're not using actual information, they're kind of just doing it how they want. So the NFL tried to dismiss, but the players fired back with a brief, and they also rejected the NFL's okay, so they said that the NFL voluntarily chose to go through with this study, so they were seen as performing above and beyond, and it was voluntary, so it no longer was in the provisions because it was outside of it. So a lot of the players who are in it are not covered under the collective bargaining agreement because anyone before 1968 and anyone between the years 1987 and 1993, when there wasn't one, are kind of left out in the open. A Stanford University law professor went through it. Climbed for security guards. This case really doesn't matter, but it's how it's handled in the 3rd District Court. So they took surveillance videos of employees, and the employees sued. Kind of real weird. So the collective bargaining agreement mentioned job security, but it did not mention any provisions related to surveillance. So when they went to the court and argued this, the players argued that the collective bargaining agreement mentioned health and safety, but did not mention the NFL's duty of care to its players, like in Klein, where the collective bargaining agreement mentioned job security, but not surveillance. But the NFL argued that the collective bargaining agreement mentioned health and safety, like Klein mentioned job security, and since the collective bargaining agreement speaks directly to player injuries, it needs to be preempted. So Judge Anita B. Brody, encouraged the NFL, they wanted them to reach a settlement, so she forced them into mediation. These players needed help now. They could have drawn the litigation out for years, but a lot of these men are dying and they need help now. So they just wanted it to be resolved. They had given the NFL some of the best years of their lives, and now they're dying. So August 29th, court-appointed mediator Lane Phillips, that's him, announced that the NFL and over 4,500 former players reached an agreement of $765 million for medical benefits. Ooh, that's a good typo. Okay, and injury compensation for former players and litigation costs. Retired players who are determined to have a cognitive injury by another party doctor would get their financial benefits. So she had to go through and make sure it was fair and reasonable based on the cost, litigation, claims, defense. So April 22nd, 2015, United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania entered a final order and judgment approving the settlement. And April 3rd, the 3rd District Court affirmed the District Court's order in full because there were, on the right side, are people who kind of tried to petition it. So, former players have commended the NFL for doing the right thing. That is Kevin Turner, who died this year from CTE. He said it provided the help that he needed now because he died recently. If they wouldn't have come through, he would have been suffering. His family would have had crazy amounts of medical bills. But because the commission that they made to kind of study the CTE, the players think there's something hidden in it that they do need to know, and it's being hidden. So unless players want to opt out of the settlement and try to break through the preemption seal, there's nothing they can do, and they can just keep whatever they want hidden. So as I said, if you watch NFL, you see new actions and rules that they try to make. They've also started brain injury research with General Electric, Under Armour Sports and Health Research Program. It's claimed that they have fewer concussions, but like I said, are people just not reporting them? They're not really sure what's happening. Player culture, that's Mark Walzak with Junior Seau. He said they don't report head injuries. He had unreported concussions too, but you're a player, you just kind of play through them. You just got to get your job done. And the warrior culture of the NFL is I kind of just fight through anything, but it does jeopardize their health. Like retired Chicago Bears linebacker Brian Urlacher says, it's football, you're going to take some hard hits. So meeting the objective, how the legal parties could have been better prepared to deal with the legal issues. The NFL is pretty well prepared to handle these things, as most cases do just get preempted right away. The NFL players, before signing the collective bargaining agreement, should probably look into what would happen if they do need help. But the big question that I think that everyone needs to look at is if they had informed the players of the risks associated with concussions, could they have protected themselves from being sued for fraud, intentional misrepresentation, negligence? So if they would have given the results of their study, would the players have been able to still sue them? And then there's your citation. Sorry that was so long.
The pond by this particular factory, they've been dumping coal into it for about, it's been running since about 1950. And the main issue with coal ash is it's incredibly toxic. That piece of coal has about, it contains sulfur, lead, cadmium, all these heavy metals, and that all turns into, well, just kind of starts floating around when they put it into these ponds. So what happened is the pond leaked, and it leaked bad. And yeah, so what happened is they built it with 2 storm drains under it. One of those leaked. They found this out early 2014. And what happened is, well, that's a huge violation of the Federal Clean Water Act. You cannot poison people, is basically what that means. And about 1 million people get their drinking water from the Dan River. And so, yeah. What happened is they got brought up, but what happened is they also found out that every single one of their plants in the state of North Carolina and Virginia had these issues. The ponds that they used were not lined, which meant that it was seeping into the groundwater. If it seeps into the groundwater, everybody drinks it, everybody has lead poisoning. Not a good time. But the other issue is every single one of these plants are by rivers. They have to be by rivers just for the fact that they need to have water cooling them down. Now they built all these coal ash ponds by the rivers. So the main thing about this, the Dan River was not their big battleground. Their big battleground is across the state. They keep finding these ponds that are leaking stuff into it. And they keep getting brought up on new charges. Now it's not, well this is the Dan River. You can see it's clearly leaking in. And that's all incredibly toxic. All of it. It's just incredibly poisonous, and the main issue with it is it kills all the fish in the river, and if anybody drinks it, it can cause anything from birth defects to death. Not good. And so that was the outcome. Duke Energy pled guilty because they are guilty in every sense of the word. $68 million in criminal charges. That's just for the charges, and then they charged them an extra $34 million just for river cleanup of the Dan River, and also certain projects going on around the state. They're just trying to fund cleanup efforts, and they're on 5 years probation, which just means if they willfully find them just ignoring these issues that led to the leak, they will prosecute them very heavily. And well, there are 32 of these ponds. And not necessarily all of these ponds are still running. A lot of these ponds are just old coal factories that they stopped using. And when they stopped using them, they just kind of left them. They didn't monitor them, they didn't perform any checks on them, they just kind of closed up shop and wanted to see what would happen, I guess. And 18 of their plants are still open, still burning, putting out energy and coal ash. And now the thing that they have to do, the regulations they have to do, they have to ensure that they just basically ignored it until it was an issue. There are third parties that are now being put in place by the state that are monitoring these ponds, and they had to, all the old ones that they weren't using anymore, they capped and sealed them. They lined the beds of the pond. A lot of them had dried up, so they had to take the ash in the pond and move them away, dispose of it properly. Some environmental impacts. Anywhere from 50 to 82 tons has leaked into the river. That's a lot. If you've seen ash, ash is very light, and if you think about it, 1 pound of ash is big. It's bigger than that. It's way denser than coal is. So, yeah, not good. 1 million people drink from the Dan River. Not good. And now the list of poisonous things that can be antimony. That's poisonous. Boron, poisonous. Iron, poisonous. Manganese, poisonous. Dissolved solids and sulfates. Sulfates, lead. Coal contains a lot of sulfur. Sulfur affects your frontal lobe, so people go absolutely insane. If you ever read people going across the frontier, they got exposed to sulfur and they immediately went insane. Some of them became cannibals, so pretty interesting. And then there's just the raw effect on the ecology around. And the reason the state is so interested in prosecuting these cases is that there's continued environmental impacts from this. This stuff doesn't go away just because you start ignoring it. This stuff, well, it's heavy elements. They don't get washed down river very easily, and they just kill things. And, you know, a fish eats it, bird eats the fish, now the lead is in the bird. Even if, like, the river floods with this stuff in it and gets into farmland, all of those crops are done. So the damage, the monetary damage from this is still yet to be seen. Now, right now, it's calculated about $300 million in damage just from this one Dan River leak. And they're finding other places, they're investigating it. They're trying to find what the old ponds are doing. If it's seeping into the groundwater, and if it seeps into the groundwater, it'll affect wells. Most farmers out here don't go off of like city water. Well, in the state, they don't go off of municipal water supplies. They have private wells. If these things leak into those wells, well, they're watering their crops with sulfur. That's not good. And so that is what happened at the Dan River plant. They built the pond, and there were 2 drains under it, leading directly into the Dan River. They found out, they looked at these drains in about 1980, and they said, meh, and just kind of went on with their day. And they didn't think it was going to leak. Early 2014, that happened. We don't know how long it had been leaking. We don't know how much it come out. We don't know if flooding, heavy rains had affected it and made more come out. All we know is that a lot came out, and that it was, the EPA had come into the spot and seen it several times and said, that's an issue, that's going to leak, and they ignored it. That's why they have no case. That's why they're completely and utterly guilty in every single way. The EPA looked at that 3 or 4 times and said, high risk, that's gonna leak. And they just said, no, and went on with the day. So yeah, broken storm drains, pond was unlined, all of this stuff was, Amen, thank you. All of this stuff was leaking into the groundwater too, which causes a whole list of issues. Now, main thing that they could have did to stop this, one, not put the pond by a river, and not have 2 drains under it. I feel like that was simple. And all their systems, all their levees, dams, things to keep the pond in place in case of a heavy rain, improperly maintained, improperly built, hadn't been looked at since 1980. Not a good system. Events leading up. 12 other coal ash ponds were listed as high risk. High risk of all of these awful things in this pond getting out and killing people. Duke Energy did nothing every single time. The storm drains. Employees were constantly requesting money to just, what they wanted to do is they want to buy a little robot that they could put in, it had a camera on it, and so it could go down and look at the storm drain and check for leaks. Duke Energy said no. It would have cost 20 grand for them to buy the robot. 20 grand for this company, it's worth $5 billion, so they have no excuse. They did perform checks in the pond annually, but it was not regulated. It was just their own employee going out and looking at it, and they checked it after heavy rain, which is, you know, that's a federal guideline, so they have to. Possible future impacts, groundwater contamination. Groundwater moves very slow. If it gets into the groundwater, we could see it getting into drinking supplies 10 years later. We wouldn't even know. So, a little bit dangerous there. There are several wetlands nearby. If you introduce poisons to a wetland, it dies. That's just what happens. There's no way around that. Cleanup efforts so far have done some good. The local drinking supplies from the Dan River have not been affected yet, so that's good. Statewide impacts, just the coal ash ponds all over the state, they're looking at those. It's going to cause a lot more monetary damage. I read one prediction that said it could cost over $1 billion in damages just from these ponds alone. Not counting just things that we won't see years in advance, birth defects, cancer, stuff like that, we just won't know. And that's one of the drier ponds. That used to be a pond. What happens is there were 2 ponds at the Dan River site. One had been filled up, so they started using the other one. This is a filled up one. That is just basically a wad of poison. And that's getting into the drinking water, so that's
Good.
So what did Duke Energy do illegally? Nine violations of the Federal Clean Water Act. Pled guilty to every single one for violations in their plants in Danville, Eden, and Asheville. So, you know, it's close to home. These things are bad. And they pled guilty almost immediately because they are guilty. And I'm willing to bet if they let the federal prosecutors look a little bit more into it, they would have found a lot more. So it was probably in their best efforts to plead guilty, especially because environmental groups since 2012, early 2000s, had been fighting for this, had been trying to sue them, get them into a civil suit. And this is just the criminal suit. They haven't been sued in civil court yet. And the state is funding a bunch of studies to try and find if there were any health impacts. And if they do, that civil suit will absolutely eat them alive, because that's bad. Yeah, the main thing is that it was just raw negligence on their part. They didn't look at the ponds, they didn't maintain the ponds, and even though they had been warned by several third parties and the EPA, they didn't do anything. So their legal standing, their side of the argument is basically they don't have one. They did it. They're guilty. Yeah, 9 violations, repeated warnings. Environmental groups have sued several times. Actions taken against Duke Energy. There's a lawsuit for just about every single one of these ponds that's out there. If it's near people, if it could have affected them, they have tried to sue. Now, what Duke Energy is doing is that they're appealing the criminal charges in certain cities. Wilmington tried to get $25 million out of them. They said their Sutton Station plant. They are maintaining that it hasn't hurt anybody, the chemicals that they pumped out. And just the simple fact that they could appeal it based on those grounds may spell out something bad for the rest of the people trying to sue them. Now, I think, I don't think they really have a case. I think they're trying to minimize damage, but the damage is done. Everybody knows what they're doing, everybody knows the health effects now. And they pled guilty to most of the other charges against them, so I think we're kind of done with that. Legal action that could be taken. They need to start looking into the groundwater, because if they can prove that it got into a farmer's well and poisoned a bunch of crops, that's a huge civil suit, and that'll be a pretty good payout for whoever sues. They're looking into drinking water supplies downriver, if it's getting in any reservoirs. They don't know yet, they're still looking into it. There's all sorts of research being funded by the state because this is a huge public health issue. This stuff's deadly. It is not fun. And that's the ash. Basically, you can walk into the Dan River. I will note this, the Dan River's website is still active, it's still advertising rafting. I hope they're upriver from this shit, because local ecology. Basically, most of the banks of the Dan River are now bare. The softer plants that you see, the plants that look just like marshy stuff, that doesn't survive this stuff. And that's most of the food source for most of the fish in the river. There's, they basically killed a river. Yeah.
Why'd you choose this topic?
I'm an environmental geologist.
It's a good reason.
Yeah.
It was 1430.
Did you have your work cited up there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Versus Shivo, which is, it's actually a really big case in 2005 or 2004, I guess. Basically, this woman goes into a vegetative state, and her husband and her parents argue out whether or not they're gonna pull a plug. And I picked this because personally, it was hard for me to pick a side because I can see both sides of it. But after looking into it more, it goes really, really deep, and there's a lot of appeals, and you just kind of feel bad for both sides in the whole thing. And the legal issues are whether or not it's constitutional to, she didn't have a living will, so whether or not it's constitutional to decide for her.
So in 1990, Terry Schiavo goes into cardiac arrest in her home, and she was resuscitated, but the lack of oxygen in her brain put her into a coma, or they thought it was a coma, and then after 2 months, they decided she was in a vegetative state because she didn't make any progress, she didn't come out of the coma. And then in 1992, her husband claims that a previous doctor, he files a malpractice suit claiming that he did not diagnose bulimia as her cause of infertility, and he's awarded $6.8 million, which is later reduced to $2 million, because if Terry had told the doctor that she was bulimic, there would have been a different outcome. So after paying legal fees, he goes home with $300,000, and he puts $750,000 into a trust fund to pay for her medical expenses. He claims that later, after they get into legal issues, her parents actually demanded to get some of his reward from the case. And he comes out publicly and says that though she did not have a living will, he did remember her specifically saying she would not want to be in a prolonged artificial life support without prospect of recovery. So he files to have her feeding tube removed, and her parents bring him to court to fight for her right to live. Her parents challenge his guardianship because right after she dies, or right after she goes into the vegetative state, he automatically became the guardian, and they challenge it. And instead of removing him as the guardian completely, the court appoints Richard Purse as a second guardian, and he advises the court to deny Michael's petition because he thinks that, he says, one, there is no living will, so there's no way of knowing what she would have wanted, and two, he thinks that her husband Michael wants to inherit her estate, which would have gone to her parents had he divorced her when she went into a vegetative state, which her parents actually did ask him to do, and he didn't. He's still legally married to Terry, but he's also in a relationship with Jody Sentons and fathers a child with her. And he basically says that the only reason he did this was because he wanted to remain her guardian, which he would not have done had he divorced her, and he wanted to carry out her wishes as he imagined they would be, but has no proof that's what they were. Her parents again try to challenge his guardianship, stating that he's obviously in another relationship. He's legally married to her, but not technically, not emotionally, and it's denied by Judge Greer. Her parents file a motion to feed Terry by mouth, which is not considered a life-prolonging procedure, which is from the original statement from Michael that she would not want to be under artificial life support, but if they fed her by mouth, it wouldn't be considered life-prolonging under Florida law. And Judge Greer sticks with the earlier ruling that she was not physically capable of swallowing, so he denies that motion. And then on April 24th, 2001, her feeding tube is removed, but then 6 days later, Terry's law is passed, which allows the governor of Florida, which was Jeb Bush, to intervene and order that the feeding tube be reinserted immediately. And at the same time, Terry's parents file a civil court case against Mr. Schiavo for perjury, claiming that he lied under oath. The judge orders an injunction until the case is settled and her feeding tube is replaced. Judge W. Douglas Baird denies the motion to let Terry's parents participate in Terry's law case and finds Terry's law unconstitutional. So they go back to the decision after her parents came up with so many different ways that this could have been solved. They had ideas of medical things that they could do to fix this. They had videos of her in therapy, of her what seemed to be making progress, and they in the end ended up sticking with the original decision to remove her feeding tube, and she died on March 31st, 2005. And I just found this really interesting. Her body was cremated, and her parents claim that they were not informed of the location of the burial site, which he was required by law to do. And I just thought this was really sassy, because he put beloved wife, but did not put daughter. And he departed from Earth February 1990, but then at peace March 31st, 2005. So he basically said that she was no longer with us as of 1990 when she went into cardiac arrest, and he put at the bottom, "I kept my promise," even though he was in another relationship and fathered a child. So as mentioned before, doctors tried to return her to a state of awareness, but Terry's family fully believed that she was actually aware of her surroundings. There are pictures of her in this one where she's looking directly at her mother and she's almost smiling. And there are also videos of her interacting with her father, which I have. I don't know if I'm allowed. Can I show this? Okay.
Real quick, I'm like almost at a faculty meeting right now. Don't lose your grading sheets. Same thing, your orange, you should stand out. And I'll had one student in several years misplace them for a few days. I'll get them on Monday. And Wednesday, somehow I'm not here, when you get here, you can start. You might have some computer issues again. This is a room with a lot of computer issues. And thank you, Derek, so much for coming here and recording this for me, and I will touch base with you shortly. All right? All right, thank you.
So this is the video of her in therapy with the speech therapist.
Can you see me over here now? Come on, Terry. Look over here. Can you see me? Can you see me over here?
He's over
Look at
here.
me. Come on. Look at me. Look at me over here. No, over here. Look at me over here. That's it. Come on. Terry, look to your right. Look to your right, Terry. Look to your right. Okay. Terry, look to your right. Okay. That's good. Now try that again now. Look to your right, Terry. Terry? That's it. That's it. Look there. Okay, Terry, now watch me. Focus on me. That's it. Focus.
This is where
Right,
she
focus
finally
down
looks
here.
at him.
Come on. Focus up here now. Come on. Terry, come on. Let's do this again right now for a second here. Oops.
And then
Did that.
later in the video, he
Doing
holds a
pretty good there,
balloon
Terry.
in front of her, and he actually states, he's like, "Oh, so it has to be right in your face for you to see it," because he holds a balloon and she won't look at it, but he holds it in front of her and then she follows it. So he actually states like, "Oh, it has to be in your field of vision first." And then this is her with her dad. This is it.
You're at 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
That's it, Donna.
You know she has a lazy aunt. I don't know if you're aware of that. She wore glasses all over her life. There's one eye rolls in on her, doesn't it? Huh? One eye rolls in on you, just to make fun. You remember that? You used to laugh at that. Yeah. You used to get mommy all upset when you did that to her. Take your eye and let it roll inside. Remember? Yeah.
So that's just her
Mom, you're
but
great.
with her dad. You can see that she's looking directly at him and she understands him. And that was in 2002, which was 3 years before her death. And then, I don't know if any of you guys watch Family Guy, but I watch it religiously. And 5 years after she died, which was also a few months after her dad died, her family was in mourning. It was the 5-year anniversary of her death, and then their father and husband died. And Family Guy came out with an episode with a parody that mocked her death. And her brother said that he wishes the producer Fox could see his mother's face because she was devastated. And in the episode, there's a children's musical, and they're singing Terry Schiavo's Kind of a Lido. They call her the most expensive plant you'll ever see. And the kid that's playing the doctor calls her a vegetable, and then another kid says, "I hate vegetables." And then the audience laughs, and then he pours gravy on her mashed potato greens, which is super offensive. And basically the creator of Family Guy, Seth MacFarlane, said, he was like, "It's a cartoon. I don't see it as a person, it's a cartoon." And I guess that made him feel better at the end of the day. And so Terry's family reached out to get publicity on this, to get support, and they actually lost publicity because Family Guy is aired on Fox, and Fox News is a sister channel, and they supported the Schindlers through the whole thing, but then they lost that support and they lost that publicity. And a lot of people were not only upset about her death, but the way that they went about killing her. They basically starved her to death. They took out her feeding tube and she died. She went 13 days with no food and no water, and she starved to death. And they actually have physician-assisted suicide now, which is in a recent romantic movie where he's in a wheelchair and he decides that he wants to commit suicide, but he doesn't want to do it by himself in his basement. So it's legal in other countries, and it's similar to like getting a shot when you like euthanize a pet, which sounds dehumanizing, but that's even more humane than just starving to death. And so this is her website, led by her brother, and it has her whole story and advocacy, and they reach out to people who are in similar situations. And looking back on the case, I think that both sides did all that they could do, and the case would have been different had there been a different judge, had there been different politicians, because President Bush actually flew from vacation back to DC to sign legislation to save her life, and Terry's Law might not have been passed, and Jeb Bush, who was the governor at the time, would not have been able to intervene, and basically just, it was all the judge's decisions, and I think it's an internal thing. You couldn't have changed their minds, no matter what they have done. And resources.
It's 12 minutes.
Do you know why she went into cardiac arrest? Like, what was her?
I think it had to do with her bulimia, which is what came up in the court case.